A woman called a moving company in New York and suddenly realized something was terribly wrong. The employee who answered the phone told her that her 8-year-old daughter, Eliza, never showed up for work that day. At first, the woman said nothing. Then her breathing changed. Her voice started trembling. And before hanging up, she quietly said she needed to call 911 immediately. Just moments earlier, she had walked into her house and found the entire place destroyed. Furniture overturned. Papers scattered everywhere. And upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, was something waiting that would horrify detectives for months to come. That night, the 10th of August 2005, investigators in New York began looking into what appeared to be a violent home invasion. But as the evidence started coming together, they realized the killer wasn't a stranger who broke into the house. The killer was someone who had already been standing beside the family the entire time. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button. You'll save them a seat at the movies, but then you put your code on it instead. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, the 10th of August 2005, 8-year-old Eliza Parsi was sitting on her bed in her Staten Island home, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet. Her mother, Seema, was at work, so Eliza had the place to herself until her own shift started later. Eliza had just graduated high school a few months earlier and was working as a clerk at a moving company. She was saving up for college, but her real dream was to move into Manhattan and work in the fashion industry. Still, she felt a little guilty about leaving. It would mean her mom would be all alone in the big house. Eliza's parents, who were both from Israel, had divorced about a year and a half before. Her father had moved back to Israel, leaving just her and her mom in New York. Eliza did have 2 older half-brothers from her mom's first marriage. One was also in Israel. The other, her 7-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived a short drive away. But they rarely saw him. Raviv was married with a new baby and was in charge of the family's struggling kosher cookie business. He was always busy, always stressed about money, and just didn't make it out to Staten Island much. Eliza got to the last page of her magazine and saw it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift. But first, she wanted to check her messages on her online dating profiles. So she went over to her desk and logged into her computer. Back in 2005, internet dating was just taking off, and Eliza had made a few profiles to see what would happen. She'd started messaging and meeting up with men from all over the city, but she kept it a secret from her mother. She knew Seema wouldn't approve of her dating men who weren't from their Orthodox Jewish faith. Eliza knew this for a fact because it had happened with her last boyfriend, Hassan. He was a Muslim boy she'd met at her public high school. Her family had completely disapproved of the relationship because of his religion. The pressure became too much, and Eliza eventually broke up with him. So now, she was much more secretive. She'd make up excuses to go to other neighborhoods when really she was going on dates. She had even started secretly bringing some of the guys back to her house, always sneaking them in through the back door when her mom was at work. Eliza saw a few new messages and replied to them. Then she headed into the bathroom to take a shower. A few minutes later, she turned off the water and heard a noise from outside the bathroom. She'd heard a landscaping crew next door earlier, but this was different. It was a weird banging sound. Thinking it might just be the landscapers next door, Eliza stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel tightly around herself. Then, she slowly opened the bathroom door to see where the noise was coming from. But someone was already inside the house. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, got home. She put her key in the front door, but it would only open a few inches. Something was blocking it. Confused, Seema shoved against the door until she could squeeze inside. The first thing she saw was that a heavy mirror had been propped against the door. Before she could process why, she turned on the lights and saw her living room was completely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were open, and papers were everywhere. Sema immediately felt her heart start pounding. Someone had broken into the house. But then another thought hit her. Where was Eliza? Sema knew her daughter had been home. She started calling out her name, but there was no answer. She ran upstairs and saw that the door to Eliza's room was closed. She tried the handle, but it was locked. This was wrong. Eliza never locked her door. In a panic, Sema banged on the door, screaming Eliza's name. But there was only silence. She pulled out her phone and called the moving company. When Eliza's boss told her she'd never shown up for work, Sema's stomach dropped. With trembling hands, she hung up and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the NYPD arrived. The street was swarming with neighbors, and yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front yard. He parked and walked to the house, where 2 patrol officers met him. They told him they'd responded to a robbery call, had to break down a locked bedroom door, and inside, they found the body of one 8-year-old Eliza Parsi. The officers said the whole house was torn apart, but they couldn't find any sign of a forced entry. They pointed to Sema, who was standing nearby with a young man. Kenny knew he'd have to talk to her, but first, he needed to see the scene for himself. Inside, the living room was a mess, but Kenny noticed that valuable items like the TV and stereo were sitting out in the open, untouched. That was unusual for a burglary. He went upstairs to Eliza's room. It was also ransacked. Clothes were everywhere, and the mattress was pulled off the bed, leaning against a wall. In the middle of the floor was Eliza's body. She was naked, with a towel bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked a crime scene tech if this was how they found her. The tech said no. When they first arrived, Eliza had been underneath the mattress with a pillow over her face. They had to move both to examine her. Kenny knelt down but couldn't see an obvious cause of death, no bullet or knife wounds. This suggested she might have been suffocated, maybe with that pillow. He asked if they'd found any signs of injury. The tech pointed to a few tiny drops of blood on the towel. They were small and could have been old. But all the details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, made Kenny suspect she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. He told the tech to collect the blood and any other fluids as evidence. A few minutes later, Kenny went outside to speak with Sema. She was crying on the shoulder of a young man who immediately stepped forward when he saw Kenny. He demanded to know why they couldn't see Eliza and why the police weren't out arresting her killer. Kenny took a deep breath. This was clearly Eliza's brother, and his anger was understandable. Kenny calmly explained that to find the killer, he needed information, starting with where he and Sema had been that day. The man lowered his voice and introduced himself as Raviv. He and Sema both said they had been at work all day and had alibis. Kenny then asked if they knew anyone who would want to harm Eliza. He saw them exchange a knowing glance. Raviv immediately said Kenny should look into her ex-boyfriend Hassan. Sema added that just a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her. She said it terrified Eliza, who had no idea how he'd gotten inside. Before Kenny could ask another question, Raviv suddenly started yelling at someone across the yard. "Get out. We don't want you here." Kenny turned and saw a teenage boy standing there, looking scared. Raviv then turned back to Kenny and yelled at him to arrest that boy, Hassan, because he was the one who killed Eliza. Late that night, Detective Kenny sat in an interrogation room with Hassan. So far, Hassan had been cooperative, but he didn't have a solid alibi for the time Eliza was likely killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from him, as well as from Sema and Raviv, to compare against the evidence found at the scene. But DNA results took weeks back in 2005, so Kenny hoped for a confession. He asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. Hassan didn't deny it. He admitted he had, but insisted he was just trying to talk to her to get back together. He said Eliza wasn't terrified, just annoyed, and told him to leave. Kenny noted the difference between Hassan's story and Seema's. He asked why Eliza's family disliked him so much. Hassan hung his head and said it was about religion. He was Muslim and they were Orthodox Jewish. Kenny wasn't sure what to believe. Was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend, or were they just star-crossed lovers? Either way, he had a motive and a history of sneaking into her house. But with no confession and no hard evidence, Kenny had to let him go. The next day was Eliza's funeral, held so quickly due to Orthodox custom. Kenny had just received the autopsy report. It confirmed Eliza died from asphyxiation, likely smothered by the pillow. The medical examiner also found semen showing she'd had sex within 24 hours of her death and skin cells under her fingernails suggesting she fought back. But here was the twist. The report concluded the sex had been consensual. There were no signs of sexual violence. This meant the killer was likely a romantic partner, which seemed to clear her family. But it also didn't seem to be a random burglar since nothing was stolen. At the synagogue, Kenny saw two groups, members of the Orthodox community and Eliza's friends from school. He stood in the back of the men's section and watched. The atmosphere was solemn. Then, suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. It was Hassan. He was trying to make his way to the casket. Raviv saw him, marched straight over, shoved him, and yelled at him to get out. Before a fight could break out, other men separated them and escorted Hassan out of the building. 2 weeks later, on August 24th, Kenny was with the NYPD computer crime unit. Eliza's friends had told him about her secret online dating life. The IT specialists dug into her computer and found a message thread with a man named Jonathan. They were making plans to meet at her house for sex on August 9th, the day before she was killed. Eliza told him to come to her house while her mom was at work and that she'd leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in. This plan matched the crime scene perfectly. Kenny tracked Jonathan down. He admitted he'd gone to her house and they'd had consensual sex, but he insisted he never went back to Staten Island after that. He gave a DNA sample without hesitation. Weeks passed and the case went cold. Kenny had nothing solid on Hassan or Jonathan. Then, on September 13th, the medical examiner called. The DNA results were in. The semen sample didn't match the skin cells under Eliza's fingernails. There was DNA from two different men. The semen belonged to Jonathan, confirming his story of consensual sex the day before. The skin cells found under Eliza's fingernails from her desperate fight for her life belonged to her half-brother, Raviv. Raviv was angry at his mother. The family cookie business she'd passed to him was failing, and he felt humiliated living in his in-laws' basement with his wife and new baby. He knew Seema had money from her recent divorce, money he felt was rightfully his. So on August 10th, instead of driving his delivery route, he went to his mother's house to steal it. He didn't know Eliza's work schedule had changed and that she would be home. Before searching the house, Raviv dragged a heavy mirror in front of the front door, creating a barricade in case someone unexpectedly came home. When he went into Eliza's room, he was shocked to find her coming out of the bathroom. He knew she would tell their mother what he was doing. In a panic, he tackled her, smothered her with a pillow until she stopped fighting, and then staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. He then left, only to return hours later after his mother called him, pretending to be a grieving brother. Raviv eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In the end, the person demanding justice the loudest outside the crime scene was the same person who had killed Eliza only hours earlier. Raviv had publicly blamed Hassan, comforted his grieving mother, and stood beside detectives pretending to mourn his sister. But the entire time, the killer had already been there. Hours earlier, when Seema called Eliza's workplace searching for her daughter, Eliza was already dead inside the house. and the person she should have been safest around turned out to be the one she needed protection from most. Thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. If you want to watch more true crime stories, check out the playlist linked on screen. Until next time. In March of 2015, in the sprawling, historic city of St. Petersburg, Russia, a 8-year-old woman named Tamara Samsonova was living in a state of controlled chaos. Her apartment, the place she had called home for years, was being torn apart and put back together. Renovations. Dust was everywhere, the noise was constant, and it was becoming nearly impossible to live there. A good friend of hers, a 9-year-old woman named Valentina Olenova, heard about Tamara's situation. Valentina lived nearby and had a spare room. She felt for her friend and decided to make a generous offer. She called up Tamara and said something along the lines of, "Why don't you come and stay with me while the work is getting done?" "It's no trouble at all." Tamara was immensely grateful. It was the perfect solution. She immediately accepted, packed a few bags, and moved into Valentina's quiet, comfortable apartment. From the moment she arrived, Tamara wanted to be the perfect houseguest. She knew she couldn't afford to pay rent, so she decided to contribute in other ways. She became the unofficial housekeeper. She cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, she did all the dishes, and she made sure there was always a home-cooked meal ready for Valentina. For the first couple of weeks, things were wonderful. The two women, both in their later years, enjoyed the companionship. They'd chat in the evenings, share meals, and it felt like a comfortable, easy arrangement. Valentina was happy to help her friend, and Tamara was relieved to be out of her noisy, dusty apartment. Then, after a few weeks passed, Tamara got a call. The renovations on her home were complete. It was time for her to move back. But a strange thing had happened. Tamara had gotten used to living with Valentina. She enjoyed the company, she enjoyed their routine, and frankly, she didn't want to leave. So she approached Valentina and asked, "Would it be okay if I stayed just a little bit longer? I'm really enjoying it here." Valentina was a little hesitant. The original agreement was just for the duration of the renovations. But she was a kind woman, and she didn't want to just kick her friend out onto the street. So she reluctantly agreed. "Okay," she said. "A little bit longer is fine." But a little bit longer turned into a couple of months. Spring turned into summer, and Tamara showed absolutely no signs of packing her bags or making any plans to move back to her own apartment. Valentina's patience began to wear thin. Her home didn't feel like her own anymore. The temporary guest had become a permanent fixture, and the initial harmony had curdled into a quiet, simmering resentment. Valentina started dropping hints, asking about Tamara's apartment, wondering aloud when she might be moving back. But Tamara would just brush off the questions or change the subject. Finally, in late July of 2015, Valentina couldn't take it anymore. She decided a direct confrontation was the only way. She sat Tamara down and told her straight up, "You have to go. The renovations are done. It's time for you to go home." She expected some resistance, maybe some sadness, but she didn't expect Tamara's flat-out refusal. Tamara just looked at her and said, "No, I'm not leaving." This sparked a huge fight. Voices were raised, feelings were hurt, and the tension in the small apartment became unbearable. But at the end of it all, nothing was resolved. Tamara still refused to leave. For the next couple of days, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the apartment. The two women moved around each other like ghosts, not speaking, not even making eye contact. The air was thick with unspoken anger. This Cold War was finally broken on July 23rd over something incredibly trivial. There were a few unwashed cups left in the sink. One of them was supposed to have cleaned them, but hadn't. An argument started about whose turn it was to do the dishes. But of course, it wasn't really about the cups. It was about everything else. The argument quickly escalated, and soon, Valentina was screaming at Tamara again. "You shouldn't even be here. You need to leave my home!" And Tamara was yelling back, "No, I'm not going to leave." It was another huge blowout fight filled with bitterness and frustration. But then, something shifted. As the yelling died down, Tamara's demeanor changed. She seemed to finally accept the situation. With a sigh of resignation, she looked at Valentina and said, "Okay, I get it. I need to leave. Just give me a couple of days to get my things in order and I'll be out of your hair." Instantly, all the tension just evaporated from the room. Valentina felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, she was going to get her apartment back. The fighting was over. To seal the truce, Tamara offered a peace offering. "Look," she said, "I'll make us a special dinner tonight. I'll go out and get the food." Tamara left the apartment, but she didn't go straight to the grocery store. Her first stop was a local pharmacy. She walked in and bought a large quantity of potent sleeping pills. Then she went to the market and bought all the ingredients for a traditional Russian Olivier salad, a dish she knew was one of Valentina's absolute favorites. She returned to the apartment and began to prepare the meal. The kitchen was quiet as she chopped vegetables, but her mind was anything but. She took the sleeping pills she had just purchased, and using a mortar and pestle, she crushed them into a fine white powder. Then, as she was mixing the mayonnaise-based dressing for the salad, she carefully stirred the powder in, making sure it was completely dissolved and undetectable. She served the dinner, and Valentina, hungry and happy that their conflict was resolved, ate the entire salad. She didn't notice anything wrong. The dressing was rich and creamy, just the way she liked it. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had finished every last bite, she simply cleared the plates, went up to her room, and went to bed, leaving her friend in the living room. She waited. A couple of hours later, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Tamara quietly got out of bed. She crept downstairs to the kitchen. And there, on the floor, was Valentina, passed out cold. Tamara walked over and checked for a pulse. She was still breathing. For a moment, Tamara felt a flash of disappointment. She had hoped the massive overdose of sleeping pills would have been enough to kill her. But it didn't really matter. It just changed the next step of her plan. She went to a closet where she had stashed a hacksaw. She had borrowed it from a neighbor earlier that day under the pretense of needing it for a small project. Now, she brought it back to the kitchen. Standing over her unconscious friend, Tamara began the gruesome, laborious task of dismembering Valentina's body. She worked with a strange, methodical precision. As she cut her friend into pieces, she took special care to remove the lungs, making sure not to damage them. It turns out, human lungs were a particular delicacy for Tamara. She considered them her favorite food. Once the body was in several pieces, she took Valentina's head and placed it into a large stock pot on the stove. She filled it with water and turned on the burner, beginning to boil it. While the head and the carefully preserved lungs cooked, she took the rest of Valentina's remains. She cut them into the smallest pieces she could manage, then wrapped them in a shower curtain and stuffed them into various plastic bags. The process was long and physically demanding, but Tamara worked tirelessly through the early morning hours. With Valentina's head and lungs simmering on the stovetop, Tamara began the disposal. She started making trips, dozens of them, from the apartment speed down the stairs and out the front door into the dark, silent streets of St. Petersburg. She carried the heavy bags one by one all the way down to a small lake near their apartment building where she tossed them into the dark water. Back and forth she went, trip after trip, until most of the body parts were gone. Valentina's hips and legs, however, were apparently too heavy for her to carry all the way to the lake. So, for those, she took a different route, dragging them to a nearby patch of forest and leaving them there. Her final trip was perhaps the most macabre. She carried the big silver pot from the stove. Inside was what was left of Valentina's head, after Tamara had finished eating most of it. 4 days passed. Life in the apartment building went on as normal. Then, on July 27th, a young couple who lived in the same building as Tamara and Valentina decided to take their dog for a walk near the lake. As they strolled along the path, their dog suddenly took off running. It stopped in front of a large, bulky plastic bag that had washed up near the shore. The dog began sniffing and pawing at the bag, trying to get it open. The couple called for their dog, but it wouldn't budge. It was completely fixated on the mysterious package. Annoyed, the owners walked over to see what had captured their pet's attention. The man poked the bag with his foot. It was heavy, and it felt wrong. With a sense of dread, he managed to tear it open. Inside, they found a human torso. It was Valentina's. When the police arrived, one of the first things they did was canvass the apartment building to see if anyone was missing. They quickly learned that the victim was likely Valentina Olenova. They went to her apartment to investigate and were surprised to find Tamara Samsonova living there. They approached her gently, assuming she was a grieving friend or relative. They explained that Valentina had been found deceased and that they needed to search the apartment as part of the investigation. Tamara's reaction was completely bizarre. She was totally indifferent. There was no sadness, no shock, no fear. She just calmly allowed them in, as if she knew this day would eventually come. The search of the apartment didn't take long. The officers quickly found what they were looking for. There were specks of blood all over the bathroom. There was more blood in the kitchen. They found the hacksaw she had used, still bearing traces of blood and tissue. And then they found her diary. It was sitting on a table right next to a book about black magic and the occult. When the police opened the diary, they were horrified. It wasn't just a daily journal. It was a meticulous, detailed log of ritualistic killings that Tamara had apparently been carrying out for the past 20 years. The diary described 14 different murders. According to her own writings, almost all of the killings were motivated by her desire to cast spells she was learning from her books on black magic. These spells, she wrote, required specific human components like flesh or organs. So she would kill people, use their bodies for her rituals, and then afterwards she would consume parts of them. Not because the spell required it, but simply because she said she liked the taste of human flesh. And in particular, she noted, she loved the taste of human lungs. The police arrested Tamara on the spot. She didn't put up a fight. She didn't deny anything. She looked at the officers and said, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." During her trial, Tamara's behavior was a spectacle. She seemed to be in a great mood, often smiling. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to the reporters in the courtroom gallery. It was as if she was completely detached from the reality of her horrific crimes, or perhaps she simply didn't care anymore. Tamara, who the press quickly nicknamed the Granny Ripper, was found guilty and given a life sentence. To this day, she remains in a high-security prison, one of Russia's most notorious and chilling serial killers. After spending 21 years serving in the U.S. Army, a man retired and decided to move his family to Central Florida. He, his wife, and their young son settled into a quiet life. They had plenty of money. He had his military pension coming in every month, and his wife still worked a full-time job. But after a lifetime of structure and activity in the military, he found retirement to be incredibly boring. He just wasn't the type to sit around the house all day. So, he decided he needed to find a simple job, something to keep him occupied and give him a reason to get out of the house. He ended up taking a job as a clerk at a gas station located right off a major highway. One of the main reasons he chose this particular job was because the owners were very laid back. They didn't mind if his son came to hang out with him during his shifts. So, for years, that became their routine. The man would work his shifts behind the cash register, and his son would tag along. Even as the boy grew into a teenager, when you'd think he'd want to be off with his friends, he still came along. The town they lived in was so small and quiet, there was really nothing else for him to do. So even well into his teenage years, the son would spend his evenings at the gas station with his dad. One night in 1990, the son, who was 15 years old at the time, was taking a break. He was sitting outside at a picnic table under the bright lights of the gas station's canopy. He was reading a magazine and drinking a Mountain Dew. It was a dark, quiet night. There were no cars at the pumps, no customers inside the store, and the highway itself was mostly empty. It was in this stillness that he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A figure A woman was walking off the shoulder of the highway, heading directly toward the gas station. This immediately struck him as odd. He thought to himself, no one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here. His logical conclusion was that her car must have broken down nearby, and she was coming to use their payphone to call for a tow truck. The woman continued walking across the large, empty parking lot, getting closer and closer. The boy had turned his attention back to his magazine for a moment, but he would say later that he kept looking up, keeping an eye on her. There was just something about her, something that felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The woman walked right past the picnic table where he was sitting, not even acknowledging him. She didn't say hi, didn't make eye contact, just walked straight to the glass door and went inside the convenience store. From where the boy was sitting, the front of the store was all glass windows, so he had a clear view inside. He could see his father standing behind the counter, and he could see the top of the woman's head as she began to walk up and down the aisles. As soon as she was inside, the boy put his magazine down and just watched. He noticed she wasn't really shopping. She would walk down an aisle, look down at the shelves for a few seconds, but never pick anything up. Then she would look up towards the counter and just stare at his father for a moment before looking back down and moving to the next aisle. She did this over and over, circling the small store. At some point, the woman seemed to abandon this pretense of shopping and just walked directly up to the counter. There was still nobody else in the store, and the night was so quiet that the boy could fairly clearly hear her conversation with his father. He heard her tell his dad that her car had broken down and she needed a ride. Could he drive her to Ocala? That was the next big town north of their gas station. The boy would say later that his father's reaction was very strange. Normally, his dad was incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He was chatty and friendly with everyone who came in. But with this woman, his dad's tone was dismissive, almost rude. When she asked for a ride, he just gave a short, flat answer. No, I won't give you a ride. The woman was visibly annoyed by how quickly he had shut her down. But instead of just taking no for an answer, she did something strange. She turned and looked out the window, directly at the boy sitting on the picnic bench. He was looking right back at her. She pointed at the boy and said to his father, "What about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride?" The boy saw his father, who was out of the woman's direct line of sight, look at him and shake his head no very firmly. It was a clear signal. Whatever she wants from you, you say no. The boy was confused by all this. He was still trying to understand why his dad was being so hostile and unhelpful. The woman clearly needed help, or at least she claimed to. But he trusted his dad's judgment. He knew that if she came outside and asked him directly, he would say no. But it never came to that. The boy's father said to the woman in a firm, final tone, "No, my son is not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you." The woman exploded in a fit of rage. She started cussing him out, screaming at him. She stormed towards the door, slammed it open, and stalked back out into the parking lot. She started cussing at the boy as she passed him. The whole time she was walking away, back towards the dark highway, she kept turning around, flipping them both off and screaming profanities. The father had come out from behind the counter and was now standing next to his son, watching her go. As she disappeared into the darkness, the boy turned to his dad and asked, what was her deal? Why did you not want to help her? The dad just shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "There was just something off about her. I can't explain it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I just knew she had to go." They didn't talk about it much after that. It was just a weird, uncomfortable encounter on an otherwise normal night. A year went by. The boy was in his room at home one evening when he heard his dad yelling from the living room, a sense of urgency in his voice. "Come in here. You have to see this. Look at the TV." The boy ran into the living room, and on the television screen, there was a news report. And on the screen was a mugshot. It was the same woman from the gas station. Her name, the reporter said, was Aileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who targeted men she met along the highways of Florida. The news report detailed how she would get her male victims to pick her up, often at gas stations, before robbing and killing them. The boy and his father stood there, staring at the screen in stunned silence. The chilling realization washed over them. It's unclear if the boy or his father were intended to be her next victims that night. But by the time she had walked into their gas station, she had already killed 4 men. And following that strange, tense interaction with them, she had gone on to kill 3 more people. One of those victims was found in Ocala, Florida, the very town she had asked them for a ride to. Aileen had been caught, which is why her face was on the news. She was later sentenced to death for her crimes. The boy and his father never forgot that night, the night a serial killer walked into their lives, and a father's unexplainable gut feeling may have saved them both. In the early evening of the 7th of May, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zvonka Telemakaska was in the kitchen of her small apartment in Kisevo, a quiet city in the southeastern European nation of North Macedonia. Kisevo is a peaceful place, nestled at the base of a huge mountain. It's beautiful, but also very remote. It's the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, and nothing of real note ever seems to happen. Zvonka worked as a cleaning lady to make ends meet. But on this particular day, she had the day off. She was just relaxing at home, waiting for her adult son, Zoran, to come over for dinner. It was a beautiful, warm spring evening, so Zvonka had the kitchen windows open as she moved about, preparing a simple meal for herself. At some point, her phone rang. She picked it up and answered, hearing the voice of a friend on the other end. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained, panicked. The friend asked Zvonka if she was watching the news or listening to the radio. Zvonka said no and asked why. The friend then told her that there was a breaking news story all over the local channels. There had been a huge, terrible traffic accident right there in their town. And the friend said the reports were saying that Zvonka's son, Zoran, was involved. Zvonka let out a strangled cry. She dropped whatever she was holding, and without a second thought, she turned and ran out the front door of her apartment. As she burst outside, her next-door neighbor, who happened to be outside, saw her emerge looking frantic. The neighbor called out, "Hey, is everything okay?" Zvonka, who was already running towards the main road, just blurted out over her shoulder that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. The neighbor watched as Zvonka ran down the street, turned a corner, and disappeared from sight. Zvonka didn't own a car, so she was literally going to run all the way to the hospital to get to her son. A little while later, that same neighbor heard a knock on their door. The neighbor went and opened it and was completely shocked by who was standing on the doorstep. It was Zvonka's son, Zoran. He didn't have a scratch on him and didn't appear to be hurt in any way. Before the neighbor could even process what was happening, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, asked, "Hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet for dinner, and it's totally unlike her to just disappear without telling me where she was going." The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, trying to make sense of the situation. Then the neighbor asked, "Wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident?" Zoran just looked back at them, completely bewildered. "No," he said. "What are you talking about?" The neighbor then explained what had happened just a short while ago. They told him how his mother had run out of her house in a panic, saying he had been in an accident and that she was running to the hospital. Now, it was Zoran's turn to be confused. He pulled out his phone and immediately called the local hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital staff answered, they told Zoran 2 things. First, his mother was not there. She hadn't been there at all that day. And second, while they had heard rumors about a car accident in town, no victims from any such accident had been brought to the hospital. By the end of the night, Zoran had no idea where his mother was, what had happened to her, or what this whole story about a car accident was about. He did the only thing he could think to do. He went to the police and reported his mother, Zvonka, missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, Zvonka was still missing. The police had no leads, no new information, nothing. On that day, a 5-6-year-old local reporter named Vlado Teneski, who happened to live not far from Zvonka, got a call from one of his confidential sources inside the police department. The source told him something that wasn't yet public information. Zvonka had just been found. And unfortunately, she was dead. Her body, which had been brutally beaten, strangled, and stabbed, had been found wrapped in plastic bags and dumped in an illegal garbage dump not far from the town's football stadium. The source also told Vlado that when her body was found, she still had her valuables on her, which seemed to rule out robbery as a motive. This was the part that puzzled the police. When they had started looking into Zvonka's life, they discovered she was just a poor, elderly cleaning lady. She had no known enemies. It made absolutely no sense that she would be the victim of such a brutal, personal, and violent murder that wasn't financially motivated. Vlado thanked his source for the information and hung up the phone. His source had sounded completely shocked by the murder, but Vlado wasn't so much shocked as he was suspicious. He felt like something about the official story was off. Maybe on the surface, Zvonka was just a poor cleaning lady with no enemies, but maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see. Vlado had no idea, but his reporter's intuition was telling him there was a much bigger story here and it needed to be investigated. Vlado had a reputation in Kisevo for being an aggressive, fearless journalist. He wasn't afraid to dive headfirst into murky stories involving corruption or abuse of power. He would regularly publish articles that were highly critical of the government, the police, or anyone in a position of authority. As a result, over his 30-year career, he had been threatened with violence many times for the things he had written. But even though Vlado knew this Zvonka murder case had the potential to put him in hot water again, he felt it was his duty to get to the truth. Feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, walked out of his house, and made the short walk over to Zvonka's apartment. When he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door. Soon, the two men were sitting in the kitchen, and Zoran was telling Vlado the whole strange story. He told him about the planned dinner, about finding his mom gone, and about the neighbor's bizarre story of her running to the hospital because of a non-existent car accident. As Zoran spoke, Vlado took meticulous notes, asking pointed follow-up questions. By the end of the interview, Vlado felt like he had a pretty good working theory about what had really happened to Zvonka. And the key to his theory was something Zoran had told him about his mother, that she was a cleaning lady. It took Vlado a couple of days to put his story together. He interviewed dozens more people in the neighborhood. Finally, on May 19th, just 3 days after Zvonka's body was found, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. The headline was "Explosive: A Serial Killer Stalks Kisevo." In the article, Vlado argued that Zvonka's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, he wrote, her murder was probably linked to the murders of 2 other women in their town. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zvonka. Not just in appearance, but in their lives. They were also poor older women who worked as cleaning ladies. This was the connection Vlado had made while interviewing Zoran. When Zoran described his mother, her age, and her profession, Vlado's mind had immediately gone to these other unsolved cases. The other 2 victims were 6-4-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and 5-6-year-old Lujubika Lakoska, who was murdered in 2007. Vlado's story was a bombshell. It was the first time anyone had publicly suggested that a serial killer was operating in their quiet little town. But the story was also explosive for another reason. Vlado was intensely critical of the police. He pointed out that the murders in 2005 and 2007 had been completely mishandled. An arrest had even been made in one of the cases, but clearly, Vlado argued, they had arrested the wrong person because the killer was still out there. When the police read Vlado's story, they were furious with him for his public criticism. However, they also had to admit that Vlado had uncovered a lot of details from his interviews that did seem to point towards the possibility of a serial killer. So, based almost entirely on Vlado's reporting, the police officially linked all 3 murders and began a new, high-priority investigation into a potential serial killer in their midst. But at the same time, Vlado began to notice something strange. He was being followed. Wherever he went in town to do his job, there would be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance just watching him. Vlado figured this was their way of intimidating him, a form of blowback for his critical article. He just accepted it as part of the job and continued his work. By early June, about 2 weeks after Zvonka's body was found, the police's new serial killer investigation had narrowed its suspect pool from hundreds of people down to just 3. They felt they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, Vlado was still being tailed by police, and the police had not made any public statements about the case. That day, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer. The officer told the editor that they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. As soon as the call ended, the editor tried to phone Vlado to give him the scoop. But Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his phone. The editor also thought it was strange that the police source had called him, the editor, instead of Vlado, the reporter who had broken the story wide open. The editor tried calling Vlado several more times, but he never answered. The editor eventually just assumed that Vlado must have already heard about the imminent arrest from his own sources and was probably already on scene, ready to report on it. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kasevo, police had surrounded a modest 2-story home. It was overgrown with tall fir trees, and all the windows were covered with heavy drapes. Once the house was completely surrounded, a team of officers walked up to the front porch, knocked loudly on the door, and yelled for whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. For a moment, there was just tense silence. Then, the officers on the porch heard footsteps inside. They readied their weapons. The door slowly opened, and a man, who seemed unthreatening and confused, stepped out onto the porch. The police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper office, Vlado's editor got another phone call. It was the same police officer. This time, the officer was calling to say that the arrest had been made. They had caught their serial killer. Then, he told the editor the name of the person they had arrested. When the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado Tedeschi. It turned out that while Vlado appeared professional and calm on the outside, he was filled with an inner rage, specifically directed at his own mother, who had died in 2002 and who he viewed as a cruel and terrible person. After her death, he became obsessed with getting some kind of twisted revenge on her memory. His method was to find and kill random women who reminded him of his mother, poor, older, and working as cleaning ladies. All 3 of his victims, Mitra, Ljubika, and Zvonka, had actually known Vlado's mother personally. He had used that connection to gain each woman's trust before luring them to their deaths. Vlado had manipulated the entire narrative. In his explosive newspaper story, he had made things up to throw the police off his trail. For example, he invented a witness who claimed to have seen Zvonka get into a car with 2 men right before she vanished. That was a complete lie. He was also the one who had planted the fake story on the radio about Zoran's car accident. He had called his former colleagues at the radio station, and they had trusted him and broadcast the story without fact-checking. It was a deliberate, calculated trap to lure Zvonka out of her home. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was his own arrogance. In the very article that made him famous, he included specific details about the crime scenes that the police had never released to the public. For example, Vlado wrote that all 3 victims had been strangled with telephone cords that were left at the scene. This was a detail only the killer could have known. When the police read that, they immediately became suspicious of Vlado. The police officers who Vlado thought were tailing him to intimidate him were actually tailing him because he was their prime suspect. Eventually, they covertly obtained a DNA sample from him, and it was a match to evidence found at the crime scenes. He was the killer. After his arrest, Vlado was charged with 2 of the murders, and police were preparing to charge him with the 3rd, and were even looking into a possible 4th victim. But on June 23rd, just 3 days after his arrest, Vlado was found dead in his jail cell. The circumstances were bizarre. He had apparently drowned in a small bucket of water. There were 3 other inmates in the cell with him, all of whom claimed they didn't see or hear a thing. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide. And with his death, all of the murder investigations were closed forever. On a late winter afternoon in 1985, a Canadian border security guard stood at his post, watching the line of cars waiting to cross from New York State into Ontario, Canada. As he looked out at the faces of the travelers, he felt a heavy sense of responsibility. His job wasn't just about checking passports and asking about declared goods. It was about being a gatekeeper, about making sure that dangerous criminals from the United States didn't use Canada as a hiding place. And on this particular day, there was one very specific, very dangerous criminal he was on high alert for. His name was Alex Mangal. He was 30 years old. Just a few days earlier, Alex Mangal had been pulled over for a routine traffic stop by a police officer near New York City. During that stop, things had gone horribly wrong. Alex had somehow managed to get the officer's gun, and he had shot the officer in the head, killing him instantly. Alex then fled the scene and had been on the run ever since. Law enforcement on both sides of the border was on high alert. New York was only a 6-hour drive from the Canadian border, and authorities were deeply concerned that Alex would try to slip into Canada to escape. So, an alert had been sent out to all border security personnel. They were to be on the lookout for a 30-year-old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. All day long, that Canadian border guard scrutinized every person who drove up to his checkpoint. He looked closely at every driver, every passenger. He saw a family on their way to visit relatives. He saw a young couple who said they were on their honeymoon. He saw a man whose car was packed to the brim with camping supplies. He saw a middle-aged woman traveling by herself. He saw dozens of different people from all walks of life. But none of them matched the description of Alex Mangal. By the end of his long shift, after checking car after car, he felt confident that the cop killer had not passed through his checkpoint. He clocked out and went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was on patrol in a large shopping mall parking lot in Ontario, Canada, about an hour and a half's drive from the border. As he was making his rounds, he noticed a particular car, a white Toyota, that seemed to be just loitering in the area for a long time. His suspicion piqued. He decided to drive over and check it out. As he pulled up alongside the Toyota, he looked inside and saw someone sitting in the passenger seat. It was a white man who looked to be in his 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. The officer immediately recognized him from the wanted posters. It was Alex Mangal. The officer grabbed his radio and called for backup. Then he parked his cruiser, got out, and with his gun drawn, he cautiously approached the white Toyota. As he got closer to the passenger side door, the man inside turned and saw him. In a flash, the man jumped over into the driver's seat, fired up the engine, and the Toyota screeched out of the parking spot, speeding away. The officer sprinted back to his car and took off in pursuit. Within minutes, it seemed like the entire Toronto police force had joined the high-speed chase. They managed to funnel the fleeing car down a dead-end street. The white Toyota crashed into a stop sign, and the man with the mustache and thinning brown hair jumped out. At that point, cornered and with nowhere to go, he gave up without a fight. He was taken into custody. Law enforcement was incredibly relieved to have the dangerous cop killer in custody. But they were also completely baffled. How did Alex Mangal get past border security? Every single guard was on high alert, looking for a man with his exact description. How did he slip through? The police had no answers until they searched the white Toyota that Alex had been driving. Here is what they figured out. On the night Alex shot and killed the police officer, he had fled into a nearby wooded area and hidden there overnight. The next day, he was walking around and happened to pass by a commercial building. He saw a middle-aged woman named Beverly Capone come out of the building and walk towards her car in the otherwise empty parking lot. Alex approached her, abducted her at gunpoint, and forced her to drive to an isolated cabin he knew of deep in the woods. Once they were there, he murdered her. And then, he did something truly monstrous. After she was dead, he stole her clothes and put them on. And then, he cut off her face and her scalp, and he wore them as a mask and a wig. He was literally wearing her skin and her hair. Dressed as a middle-aged woman, he got into her white Toyota and drove the 6 hours north to the Canadian border. He pulled up to the checkpoint, and he got through without anyone giving him a second look. It turned out that the Canadian border security guard, who had been so diligently looking for Alex Mangal all day, had in fact seen Alex Mangal. He just didn't recognize him. Because when Alex Mangal drove up to the checkpoint, he was wearing Beverly Capone's face, her hair, and her clothes. The guard saw what he believed was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he waved him through into Canada. The police pieced this all together when they searched the white Toyota after his arrest. Lying on the floorboard of the car, they found Beverly's dress, her scalp, and her face. Alex was deported back to the United States to stand trial for the murder of the police officer. However, before he could face justice, he attempted to escape from a prison transport vehicle. In the ensuing chaos, he was shot and killed by police. But that wasn't the end of Alex's story. Following his death, investigators continued to look into his past and search his property. During one of these searches, they made a disturbing discovery. They found a collection of photographs of unidentified women, along with several maps of New York and Pennsylvania. On these maps, various isolated remote locations were circled. No one knows what these maps or photos mean. Police have never been able to conclusively link Alex to any other murders, but he remains a person of interest in several unsolved disappearance cases. In fact, many investigators believe that Alex Mangal wasn't just a cop killer. They believe he was actually a serial killer. But because he took all of his secrets to the grave, we will probably never know for sure how many people he actually killed. On the morning of the 2nd of February 2012, a young man pulled his car off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, and into a large, snowy parking lot. He drove past dozens of parked cars until he reached a small, standalone shack that was painted a bright teal color. This was a popular drive-through coffee shop called Common Grounds, and the young man worked there as a barista. After he parked, he walked up to the white employee entrance door, pulled out his key, and went to unlock it. But as he turned the key, he realized the door was already unlocked. He knew the person who had worked the closing shift the previous night. It was an 18-year-old girl named Samantha Koenig. She had only been working at Common Grounds for about a month, but she always seemed very responsible. She had never forgotten to lock up before. The young man shrugged it off. People make mistakes. He pushed the door open and went inside. Right away, he noticed that things seemed out of place. The small kiosk was a mess. It looked like Samantha had just left in the middle of her shift without cleaning up at all. There were napkins scattered on the floor, used towels were left out on the counter, and dirty cups were still sitting by the espresso machine. As the young man walked over to the cash register to get it ready for the morning rush, he tried to run through scenarios in his head that could explain why Samantha had been so sloppy. He reached down with his key to unlock the cash register, and just like the front door, it was already unlocked. He pulled out the cash tray. All the money was gone. And that's when it hit him. They had been robbed. He immediately picked up the phone and called his boss. The night before, Samantha had arranged for her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift ended. Dwayne arrived at the Common Grounds kiosk at around 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift was supposed to be over. He had gotten held up at his own job, which was why he was late. When he pulled into the parking lot, he looked around for Samantha but didn't see her anywhere. The coffee shack itself was completely dark. It looked like it had been closed up for the night. Dwayne got out of his truck and walked through the freezing cold air up to the kiosk's service window. He pressed his face against the cold glass and peered inside, but he couldn't see anyone. His mind immediately went to the fight they'd had earlier that night over text message. She had accused him of cheating on her, and he had been dismissive about it, which had led to a really ugly argument. As Dwayne walked back to his truck, he thought to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight. Maybe she had called her dad or a friend to get a ride home at the end of her shift, and that's why she wasn't here waiting for him. He got back inside his truck and sent a text message to Samantha asking if she was okay and if she had gotten home. But after several minutes passed with no response, his worry started to grow. Even though they were fighting, he cared deeply about her. He decided he had to go by her house just to make sure she was there and that she was safe. A few minutes later, he pulled up to her house and knocked on the door. Her father, James, a single dad, answered. Dwayne explained that he couldn't find Samantha after her shift and was just checking to see if she was home. But James said, "She's not here. I haven't spoken to her. I have no idea where she is." The two men went into James's kitchen and sat down at the table. They both started calling and texting Samantha, trying to figure out where she was. After a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lit up. It was a text message from Samantha's number. The message made it clear that she was still very angry with him. It said that she needed some time to think and that she was going to stay with some friends for a couple of days. It also asked if he, Dwayne, would please let her father know where she was. Dwayne showed the text message to James. Samantha's father read it and immediately felt that something was wrong. This was very uncharacteristic of his daughter. He had raised Samantha on his own since she was 2 years old, and they were incredibly close. They told each other everything. It made no sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say she was going to be with friends. And it made even less sense that she would be ignoring all of his worried phone calls and text messages. The two men stayed up late into the night, calling and texting, hoping for another message from Samantha, but she never responded again. The following morning, with still no word from his daughter, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report. After receiving the report, an Anchorage police officer called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. The owner said that, coincidentally, she had just gotten a call from her morning barista informing her that the kiosk had been robbed overnight and that no one had been able to get in touch with Samantha. The owner told the officer that as soon as she could get the security footage from the previous night, she would send it over to the police. While they waited for the footage, some officers started calling Samantha's friends and family, but no one had seen or heard from her. Other officers went to the Common Grounds kiosk to investigate the scene. They found no signs of a struggle either inside or outside the small building. They also noted that there was a silent panic button located under the counter, which had not been pressed. So, even though Samantha's father felt that her final text message was strange, the police began to operate under the initial theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk herself and had run away. But this theory had problems. What confounded the police was how Samantha would have physically left the area. She didn't have a car that night, and the weather was brutally cold, far too cold to have just walked away. Anchorage isn't a very walkable city to begin with. And if she really was just taking a few days to be with friends, why did none of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop sent over the security footage. The footage, which had no audio, started around 8 p.m. on February 1st, the night Samantha went missing. It showed Samantha inside the kiosk, working alone. She seemed cheerful, busy, serving customers. Then, at some point, someone who is just out of the camera's view comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha turns to them, acknowledges the order, and then turns her back to make the drink. When she finishes, she turns back to the window to hand it to the person, and in that instant, her entire demeanor changes. She immediately steps back and puts her hands up in the air. A few seconds later, she reaches over and turns off all the lights inside the kiosk, plunging the interior into darkness. Then, she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, unmoving, for about a minute. Then, she slowly stands up and walks towards the cash register. She opens it, scoops out all the money, walks back to the window, and appears to hand the cash to a shadowy figure on the other side. Then, Samantha turns and kneels down again, with her back to the window. 2 more minutes pass. Then, the person outside the window leans their entire upper body through the small service window. They reach down and appear to be tying Samantha's hands behind her back. Because it was so dark inside the kiosk, the footage is extremely grainy, making it impossible to identify the person. But it's clearly a male, wearing a large hooded sweatshirt with the hood up and a hat pulled down low over his face. After he's finished tying Samantha's hands, the man leaps entirely through the window, landing inside the kiosk. He then shuts the window behind him. He pulls Samantha to her feet, puts what looks like a gun into her back, and marches her towards the employee door. He leads her out the door, across the snowy parking lot, to a white pickup truck. He puts her inside, and they drive off into the night. Over the next couple of days, the police and the FBI, who were now involved, hit one dead end after another. They had no physical evidence, no fingerprints, nothing. All they had was the grainy surveillance footage that didn't show the kidnapper's face. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, rallied the entire city of Anchorage to help search for his daughter. His passionate efforts attracted national news coverage, and soon Samantha's story was everywhere. Strangers donated thousands of dollars to a reward fund for information leading to her whereabouts. But despite the growing reward and the national media attention, no one came forward with any useful information. And there was still no word from Samantha or her captor. Then, on February 24th, 3 weeks after Samantha had been taken, Dwayne got another text message from her phone. It directed him to a specific sign in a nearby public park. Dwayne and James immediately shared the text with the police and then raced to the park, actually getting there about 15 minutes before the authorities. They walked through the gates, down a main trail, and stopped in front of the sign. It was a community bulletin board, and tacked to the board was a Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a typed ransom note. And Xeroxed onto the note was a black and white photo of Samantha. In the photo, Samantha looked dazed. She had a blank expression on her face, and she wasn't looking directly at the camera, but just off to the side. In the photo, a man's hand was visible, holding up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper, dated the 13th of February, 2012. It was a proof-of-life photo. Her captor was proving that she was still alive as of 11 days ago. For James and everyone involved, this was a small, agonizing bit of relief. At least she had been alive last week. The ransom note demanded that James deposit $30,000 into his daughter's bank account. If he did, she would be released 6 months later. On the advice of the FBI, James deposited a small portion of the ransom money into Samantha's account. Then, the FBI just waited and watched. They knew that if anyone tried to use her debit card, they could track the location of the transaction. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made from ATMs within Anchorage. Each time, the FBI was notified and rushed to the location, but whoever was making the withdrawals was long gone by the time they arrived. Security footage from the ATMs showed a man wearing a ski mask and large sunglasses, making it impossible to identify him. After those 3 withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week. There was still no word from Samantha. Then, on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but this time they were in Arizona, then Mexico, and then Texas. Again, authorities would rush to the ATMs, but they were always just a few minutes too late. But this time, they got a break. In one of the surveillance videos from a Texas ATM, they spotted the car the masked man got into before he drove away. It was a small white sedan, a Ford Focus, and they saw him get on a highway heading east. An alert was put out to law enforcement in that part of Texas to be on the lookout for that car. On March 13th, a Texas state trooper spotted the white Ford Focus parked in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby. A short time later, a man in his 30S came out of a hotel room, walked to the car, and got in. The trooper followed him as he pulled out onto the road. He was looking for any reason to pull him over. He clocked the car with his radar gun and saw it was going 2 miles per hour over the speed limit. That was enough. He flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. The trooper walked up to the driver's side window. The man inside was calm. The trooper asked for his license. The man handed him an Alaska driver's license. His name was Israel Keys. He was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The trooper knew this was their guy. He called for backup, and soon, Keys was in custody. A search of his car turned up a ski mask, clothes that matched the description from the ATM videos, a gun, Samantha's cell phone, and her debit card. After his arrest, Keyes initially denied any involvement in Samantha's disappearance. But when presented with the overwhelming evidence against him, he caved. He said he would tell them the whole story of what happened to Samantha, but only if they met his demands: an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers bar, and a cigar. Once the investigators provided these items, he began to talk. And the story he told was so disturbing, so graphically violent, that the FBI has still not released the full transcript of his confession to the public. Here is what happened, based on the details that have been made public. On February 1st, Israel Keyes had decided to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting to find a teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He ordered an Americano, but as she turned her back to make his drink, his plan suddenly changed. He wasn't just going to steal money. He was going to steal Samantha. When she turned back and handed him the drink, he pulled out his gun and told her it was a robbery. He forced her to turn off the lights, get on the ground, and hand over the money. Then he tied her hands, jumped inside the kiosk, stuffed napkins in her mouth to keep her quiet, and marched her out to his truck. Once they were in the vehicle, he told her that if she tried to escape or scream, he would kill her. He said she was very obedient and composed, despite being terrified. Keyes then took her phone and sent the text message to her boyfriend, Dwayne, creating the lie that she was with friends. He told Samantha he was holding her for ransom. She told him her family was poor and they wouldn't be able to pay much. Keyes replied, "Don't worry, they'll find a way." He drove around Anchorage for hours, then eventually went back to his own house. He made Samantha lie down in the back seat and covered her with tarps, telling her he would kill her if she moved. Then he went inside his house, where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. He was scheduled to leave with his daughter in just a few hours for a 2-week-long luxury cruise to New Orleans. Keyes went back out to his truck, put a blindfold on Samantha, and led her to a shed in his backyard. Inside, he sat her on a bucket and tied a rope around her neck, anchoring it to the wall behind her so she couldn't move. He cranked up a radio to mask any noise she might make, and told her again that he would kill her if she screamed. He gave her a couple of cigarettes and told her everything was going to be fine, that as soon as he got the ransom money, he would let her go. He turned on a couple of space heaters to keep her from freezing, then he left and locked the shed door. He went back inside, had some wine, and then a little while later went back out to the shed with a cup of water for her. He told investigators that Samantha asked him if he had spoken to her father about the ransom. Keyes lied and said yes, that everything was going according to plan. Then, in a moment of unimaginable cruelty, he untied her wrists and took the rope from around her neck. For a brief second, Samantha must have thought her nightmare was over. But then, Keyes grabbed her and tied her up again, much more tightly this time. He told investigators he just wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she was never going to be let go. He said that as he was tying her up the second time, she had a look of total resignation. She knew what was about to happen. After tying her up, he went back inside one last time to make sure his daughter and girlfriend were still asleep. They were. He went back to the shed. He assaulted Samantha. Afterwards, as he was getting dressed, she looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to kill me?" He said, "Yes, I am." Shortly before 4 a.m., he killed her. He told investigators she never made a sound. After she was dead, he left her body in the shed, went inside his house, and took a shower. Then he woke up his daughter and told her to get ready for their trip. While she was getting ready, he went back out to the shed, rolled Samantha's body in a tarp, and pushed it into a corner. He turned off the heaters and the music, locked the shed, and went back inside to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a taxi picked them up, and they left for the airport to begin their 2-week vacation. When he returned from the cruise, Keyes went back into the shed. He unrolled Samantha's body from the tarp. He then dressed her in new clothes, applied makeup to her face, braided her hair, and then used thread to stitch her eyelids open to make it look like she was alive and alert in a photograph. He held up the newspaper next to her and took the picture that would become the proof-of-life photo in the ransom note. After that, he dismembered her body and dumped the pieces in a frozen lake nearby. It turned out Samantha was not Israel Keys' first victim. He was a prolific serial killer who preyed on completely random people for the thrill of it. For years, he had been burying kill kits all over the United States. These were caches filled with guns, zip ties, and tools for disposing of bodies. This way, no matter where he was in the country, if he got the urge to kill, he could just dig up his nearest kit and go hunting for a random stranger. He told investigators that the moment he saw Samantha in the coffee kiosk, he knew he was going to kill her. The robbery, the ransom, it was all just an elaborate lie to control her and give her false hope. Keys admitted to killing Samantha and an older couple in Vermont, but in December of 2012, before he could name any of his other victims, he took his own life in his jail cell. To this day, no one knows for sure how many people Israel Keys killed. The best guess, based on a drawing of 11 skulls that he made in his cell, is at least 11. But it's just a guess. The true number of his victims is a secret he took to the grave. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.